Imagine waking up in Jerusalem in AD 33 to find that Jesus' tomb is empty. Fear takes over the streets. Rumors spread among the disciples. Soldiers are in shock, and no one can explain what really happened that morning. But what if you could see with your own eyes what the most impactful moment in history was like? In this video, you will enter Jerusalem on the day of resurrection and feel the weight, mystery, and hope that changed the world forever. Have you ever stopped to think about what really happened that morning in Jerusalem? Not as a distant, beautiful story repeated in services and sermons, but as a real event with the smell of earth, with tired bodies, with hearts destroyed by grief and doubt. That city was not expecting a miracle. I was trying to survive the silence that came after the cross, and it was right there, in the midst of fear, darkness, and hopelessness, that something happened, something that no human power could contain, explain, or reverse. If you feel that your faith needs to step out of comfort and onto the ground of truth, this video is for you. 1. The night before. Jerusalem was silent, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of someone who has just witnessed something terrible and still doesn't know how to react. Jesus' crucifixion had taken place hours earlier. The body was hurriedly removed from the cross before the Sabbath began and placed in a borrowed tomb given by Joseph of Arimathea, a wealthy man who had hitherto hidden his sympathy for Jesus. Nicodemus helped prepare the body, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 30 kilos of spices. The body was wrapped in linen bands, as per Jewish custom, and deposited inside a rock-cut tomb in a garden area near Golgotha. You need to understand the weight of that night. The disciples were not gathered together planning the next step. They were scattered, afraid, in shock, without direction. Peter had denied Jesus 3 times within hours of the previous day. Judas was already dead. The others hid behind locked doors, fearing that the same soldiers who had arrested the master would come for them as well. There was no hope in that group. There was only pain, shame, and silence. Meanwhile, the religious leaders of Jerusalem did not rest. Even on the Sabbath, they went to Pilate and asked that the tomb be sealed and guarded by Roman soldiers. The reason was simple. They remembered that Jesus had said that he would rise again on the 3rd day. They didn't believe it, but they were afraid that the disciples would steal the body and spread this story. Pilate granted the request. The tomb was officially sealed with the seal of the Roman Empire, and a guard was stationed in front of the entrance. That stone wasn't just heavy, she carried the authority of Rome. The night of the Sabbath fell upon Jerusalem like a heavy veil. The streets were empty, the markets closed, the synagogues in silence. No one talked about Jesus openly. Those who followed him were afraid. Those who condemned him wanted to forget. And those who just watched from afar tried to understand what they had seen. The whole city seemed caught between 2 worlds, between what happened on the cross and what it did not yet know was coming. This night is important because it reveals something about the way God acts. He is not in a hurry to prove anything to anyone. While everyone slept, while fear reigned, while the powerful thought they had won, God's plan was in full swing. The silence of that night was not absent. It was preparation. And everything that would come next would change the history of humanity forever. You need to learn to recognize God's silences in your own life, because often what looks like abandonment is actually the exact moment when he is about to act. 2. The broken seal. The Roman seal was not a simple piece of wax. It was a statement of authority. When Pilate authorized the sepulchre of Jesus to be sealed, he was placing on that stone the weight of the entire empire. To violate that seal meant to defy Rome. It meant the death penalty. No group of frightened fishermen would have the courage, structure, or reason to face this risk. And that's exactly why what happened that morning is so impressive. The seal was broken, but not by human hands. Matthew's gospel relates that there was a great earthquake, and that an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled away the stone, and sat on it. Pay attention to this detail. The angel did not remove the stone so that Jesus could leave. Jesus, resurrected, did not need anyone to make way for him. The stone was removed so that people could look inside and see that the tomb was empty. The removal of the stone was not an act of liberation. It was an act of revelation. The angel's face, according to the Bible account, shone like lightning, and his garments were white as snow. The Roman soldiers, men trained for war, hardened by military discipline, were paralyzed with fear. The text says that they were left as dead. They did not flee immediately. They were overwhelmed by something they had never faced, the presence of the supernatural invading the natural world in a brutal and undeniable way. These men, who represented the largest army in the known world, could not stand before the glory of God. You need to absorb this moment seriously. The seal of Rome was treated as nothing. The political, military, and religious power that had come together to keep Jesus in the tomb was swept away in seconds. And this did not happen with an army. It happened to an angel. A single heavenly messenger was enough to undo everything the world had built to prevent the resurrection. This shows something that you need to engrave in your heart. No human structure, no matter how powerful, can prevent what God has ordained. The breaking of the seal is more than a historical event. It is a permanent spiritual statement. It means that no decree, no sentence, no impediment placed on your life has authority over what God has already decided to do. If Rome couldn't hold Jesus, nothing can hold back what God wants to deliver in you. The stone was removed not as a request for a license, but as an act of sovereignty. And the angel sat on her, not to rest, but to make it clear that what was once a barrier was now a throne. That's the God you serve. 3. Stone removed. When the first women left home that Sunday morning, it was still dark. They carried spices, aromatic oils, everything that was necessary to complete the preparation of Jesus' body, something that could not be done properly because of the rush before the Sabbath. The way to the tomb was short but heavy. Each step carried the grief of those who loved deeply and did not know what else to do with this love. They did not go to the grave with the expectation of a miracle. They went in pain. They were going to perform a farewell ritual. A question worried the group during the journey. Who will remove the stone for us? They knew they didn't have enough strength. The stone used to close graves of that type could weigh more than a ton. It was fitted into a rail dug into the rock and rolled to seal the entrance. Once in position, it could only be moved by several men. The women had no help. They had no plan. They only needed to be close to the body of the man who had changed their lives. When they arrived, they saw what no one expected. The stone had already been removed. The tomb was open. The entrance visible. Not a single soldier in sight. No seal intact. No natural explanation for what they were witnessing. Their hearts must have raced. Fear and confusion were mixed in an instant. Because it was one thing to cry in front of a closed tomb. It was another, completely different, to find it open without knowing what had happened to the body of the one you love. This moment deserves deep reflection, because those women represent something that many people live to this day, carrying spices to a place where God has already acted. How many times have you gone into a situation with your own solutions, your own plans, your own resources, and when you got there, God had already solved it in a way you couldn't have imagined? The stone was already removed. The answer had already arrived before the question, and everything you brought in your hands became unnecessary. God does not wait for your ability to act. It does not depend on its strength, its strategy, its influence. As these women walked in the dark, worried about the stone, the sky had already moved. The answer came before the prayer was formulated. And when they arrived, they did not find the problem they feared. They found the emptiness that would change everything. Because sometimes the greatest sign of God's action is not what you find inside the grave. It is what He does not find. The absence there was the greatest proof of God's presence. And that truth lives on for anyone today who walks in the dark, carrying the weight of something God has already removed. 4. Panicked guards. As the women approached the tomb with their spices, the Roman soldiers guarding the tomb had already faced something that no amount of military training could prepare them to endure. These men belonged to the most disciplined, most feared, and most efficient army of the ancient world. They were not volunteers. They were war professionals. Sleeping on duty was punishable by death. Abandoning the post meant summary execution. And yet something knocked them down. The biblical account says that in the face of the earthquake and the appearance of the angel, the guards trembled and were left as if dead. They did not faint from weakness. They were overwhelmed by something that surpassed any threat they had ever faced. These men had already seen battles, blood, violence, death. None of this made them back down. But the manifestation of God's glory instantly paralyzed them. What does that tell you? He says that there is a dimension of reality that human beings do not control, do not understand, and cannot resist when it manifests itself. When the soldiers recovered, they fled. They went straight to the religious leaders, not to Pilate. This detail is essential. They did not report to the Roman commander. They reported to the priests. Because they knew that what they had seen was not military, it was spiritual. And they knew that the priests had a direct interest in that. What happened next is one of the most revealing moments in the entire narrative. The chief priests met with the elders, and together they offered a significant amount of money to the soldiers to lie. The command was clear: say that the disciples came at night and stole the body while you were sleeping. Think of the fragility of this lie. If the soldiers were asleep, how did they know the disciples were? If they were awake, how did they allow the robbery? The story does not hold up from any angle, but he didn't need to support himself. It just needed to be repeated. And that's exactly what happened. Money bought silence. The lie was spread. And for years, this version circulated among those who preferred any explanation to the truth that confronted them. This mechanism is not in the past. It is repeated to this day. Whenever God acts in a powerful way, someone comes along offering an alternative explanation, a diversion, a more comfortable narrative. Whenever spiritual truth manifests itself, there are voices willing to stifle it, buy it, replace it with something that does not require a change of life. The guards were eyewitnesses to the greatest proof of the resurrection. They saw the angel, they felt the earthquake, and even so, they chose the money. They chose the lie. They chose the side that paid the most. This is not just an old account. It is a mirror. Because many people today see God's truth with their own eyes, and yet choose to live as if nothing had happened. The question that remains is, when God reveals himself to you, what do you do with that revelation? 5. The empty tomb. Of all the details of that morning, none is more disturbing than emptiness. It was not what they found inside the tomb that changed history. That's what they didn't find. The body was not there. The linen bands were folded. The handkerchief that covered Jesus' face was separated, rolled up in a separate place. Everything organized, all intentional. No sign of haste, no sign of violence, no sign of theft. If someone had stolen the body, he would not have stopped to fold the burial cloths. In any robbery, haste is what dominates. But there, inside that rock-cut tomb, there was order. There was purpose. There was the silent mark of someone who did not run away, but got up. And this is something that needs to go deep into your understanding. Jesus was not taken out of the tomb. He left. The empty tomb is the center of everything. Without it, there is no Christianity. Without it, the cross is only an execution. The Apostle Paul said with absolute clarity, "If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is vain, and your faith is also in vain." Paul understood that the resurrection is not a complement to the Christian faith. It is the foundation. It all depends on that tomb being empty. And he is. No historical evidence has ever presented a body, No Roman record, no Jewish documents, no opponent of the Christian faith in 2,000 years has been able to prove that the body was anywhere. Jesus' enemies had every interest in finding the body. If they had, the Christian movement would have died right there in the first week. It was enough to show the corpse. It was enough to point to the remains. But no one did that. Because there was no body to be shown. The tomb was empty. And this absence screamed louder than any speech, any argument, any attempt at explanation. You need to understand what the empty tomb means for your life. It is not just a historical data of the year 33. It is a permanent declaration that death does not have the last word, that what seemed like the end was actually the beginning of something the world had never seen. The emptiness of the tomb is the most concrete proof that there is life beyond what the eye can see, power beyond what the hands can touch, and hope beyond what reason can calculate. If that tomb remains empty to this day, then everything Jesus said about himself is true. And if it's true, you need to decide what you're going to do with it. Because the empty tomb does not ask for your opinion, he demands an answer. 6. Mary in the garden. Among all the people who were near the tomb that morning, Mary Magdalene is the one who deserves special attention. She was not a leader. She was not a priestess. She had no religious position. She was a woman who had been delivered by Jesus from 7 demons, someone whose entire life was transformed by a personal encounter with him. And when they all fled, when the disciples hid, when fear took hold of Jerusalem, Mary went to the tomb, alone, in the dark, no guarantees. She arrived and saw the stone rolled away. He ran back to warn Peter and John. He said that they had taken the body of the Lord. He did not think of resurrection. He thought of robbery. He thought the worst, because pain still dominated his interpretation of the facts. And this is profoundly human. When you are immersed in pain, even God's signs seem threatening. Even the answers seem like new problems. Mary was so grieved that she could not see what was right before her eyes. When Peter and John went to the tomb and confirmed that it was empty, they returned home. But Maria stayed. He stood there, outside, crying. And it was at that moment that 2 angels appeared and asked, "Woman, why are you crying?" She answered with the same pain, "Because they took away my Lord, and I don't know where they put him." Then she turned and saw someone standing there in the garden. He thought it was the gardener. I said, "Sir, if you took it out of here, tell me where you put it, and I will get it." And then Jesus said a single word, "Maria." Just her name, nothing more. And in that one word, everything changed. She recognized him, not because of the appearance, not by logic, but by the voice, by the way he pronounced her name. There is something at this moment that goes beyond any theological analysis. He is the God of the universe, fresh from the dead, choosing to appear first not to priests, not to rulers, not to leaders, but to a woman weeping alone in a garden. This says something powerful about the way God works. He does not seek the important ones. Look for those who stay. He seeks those who mourn. He seeks out those who, even without understanding anything, refuse to leave. Mary wanted to hold him. Jesus said, "Do not detain me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go and tell my brothers that I am ascending to my Father and your Father, my God and your God." And so Mary Magdalene became the first witness of the resurrection, the first voice to announce that Jesus was alive. He was not an apostle. He was not a scribe. It was a woman who loved too much to leave. And perhaps this is the greatest teaching of this moment. God's revelation does not come to those who understand more. It comes to those who remain. 7. Rumors in Jerusalem. The news did not spread as an official announcement. There was no proclamation in the streets, no decree read in the synagogues, no messenger sent by the Sanhedrin. Jesus' resurrection came to Jerusalem in the most humane way possible, through whispers, nervous conversations, looks of astonishment, and accounts that seemed too impossible to take seriously. The first to speak were women. And in a society where female testimony had no legal value, this is a detail that deserves deep attention. If someone wanted to invent a first-century resurrection story, they would never use women as the main witnesses. It would be an absurd strategy. No myth maker would choose witnesses that the culture itself discarded. And yet the Gospels record just that. The first people to see the empty tomb and hear the announcement of the resurrection were women. This is a clear sign that the report was not fabricated. It was recorded as it happened, without adjustments for cultural convenience. When the women told what they saw, the disciples' reaction was one of incredulity. Luke records that their words sounded like delirium. They didn't believe it. They didn't rush to celebrate. They did not kneel down to worship. They doubted. They discarded it. They ignored it. And this needs to be said clearly because many people think that the early Christians were naive, gullible, ready to believe anything. The truth is the opposite. They resisted. They questioned. They needed proof. And the test came, one by one, over the following weeks. Meanwhile, the priest version was also circulating. The soldiers, paid to lie, spread the story that the body had been stolen. Two narratives competed in the streets of Jerusalem, that of the resurrection and that of the robbery. And each person who listened had to choose which one to believe. There was no possible neutrality. The tomb was empty. That was a fact. The question was, what happened to the body? And each answer to that question led in a completely different direction. Jerusalem in those days was a city divided between fear and amazement. Those who followed Jesus began to feel something they did not yet know how to name, a hope that was born of the impossible. Those who condemned him felt something different, the restlessness of those who know that history did not end as they planned. And in the midst of it all, the truth kept moving, silent, firm, unstoppable. Because God's truth doesn't need a campaign. It does not need political support. It does not need institutional approval. It advances on its own. And the more they try to silence it, the louder it echoes. Jerusalem was about to find this out in the most radical way possible. 8. Hidden disciples. While the whole city was seething with rumors and fear, the men who had walked with Jesus for 3 years were locked inside a house. The doors closed, the windows covered. The fear was real, concrete, justified. If the Romans and the priests had killed the master, what would prevent them from coming after the followers? They didn't know what to do. They had no plan, no visible leader, no courage. They were a group of ordinary men who had lost everything they had staked their lives on. Peter was among them, the same Peter who, days before, swore that he would die for Jesus. The same one who drew the sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, but also the same one who, in the face of a simple question from a servant, denied knowing the Master. 3 times, and then he wept bitterly. Peter was not only afraid of the Romans, he was afraid of himself. Because when the most important moment came, it failed. And carrying that weight was heavier than any external threat. The others were not in a very different condition. Thomas, who would later verbalize his doubt directly, probably already carried this disbelief in silence. The sons of Zebedee, who had asked to sit at the right and left of Jesus in his kingdom, now could not even go out into the street. The group that was supposed to change the world was paralyzed, fragmented, without direction. And this is one of the most important details of the resurrection narrative, because it shows that God does not choose ready-made people. It chooses broken people. What happened inside that house in the following days changed everything. Jesus appeared to them. He walked through locked doors. He showed the marks of the carnations. He said, "Peace be with you." It did not begin with rebuke. He did not start by pointing out flaws. It started with peace, and that's God's way. He doesn't wait for you to fix yourself before introducing yourself. He comes into your house locked up, in your fear, in your shame, and says, "Peace." Not because you deserve it, but because he is who he is. Those frightened men became a few weeks later the bravest preachers the world had ever seen. Peter, who denied Jesus for fear of a servant, preached before thousands on the day of Pentecost. Those who went into hiding began to face arrests, flogging, persecution, and death. And none of them backed down. None of them went back. Because they had seen something that no fear could erase. They had seen the risen Christ. And after seeing this, hiding would never be an option again. The transformation of those men is in itself one of the greatest proofs of the resurrection. Because no one dies for a lie they have invented. They died because they knew it was true. 9. The recognition. The resurrection of Jesus was not an event that everyone understood immediately. Even those who had been closest to him during his ministry were slow to recognize what was happening. Mary Magdalene thought he was the gardener. The disciples on the road to Emmaus walked miles beside him without realizing who he was. And this reveals something that goes far beyond a simple failure of perception. It reveals that spiritual recognition is not automatic. It requires openness. It requires surrender. It requires a disposition of the heart that goes beyond what the eyes can process. In the account of Emmaus, two disciples walked from Jerusalem to a small village, discouraged, arguing among themselves about the events of the last days. Jesus approached and began to walk with them. He asked what they were talking about. They stopped with sad faces and said, "Are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened?" And then they told everything: the crucifixion, the death, the rumors about the empty tomb. They said something that carried all the disillusionment in the world. We hoped that it was he who would redeem Israel. Jesus listened. And then he began to explain, from Moses and all the prophets, what the scriptures said about him. He opened text by text. He showed how everything pointed to that moment. And as he spoke, something began to burn inside them. When they arrived in the village, they asked him to stay. They sat down to eat. And when Jesus took the bread, gave thanks, and departed, their eyes were opened. They recognized, and in that instant, he disappeared. This moment teaches something that few people understand. The recognition did not come through speech. It didn't come for the explanation. It came in the breaking of bread. It came in a simple, everyday, intimate gesture. God does not reveal himself only in the great moments. It reveals itself at the table, in silence, in the most ordinary act of life. And often you're so focused on looking for God in earthquakes that you don't realize he's sitting next to you, breaking bread with you. After Jesus disappeared, the two disciples looked at each other and said, "Didn't our hearts burn as he spoke to us on the way?" They already felt it. They already knew on some deep level that something was different, but they only recognized it later. And this is real. That's how it works in many lifetimes. God is acting, speaking, leading, but recognition only comes when the eyes of the Spirit are opened. It's not a matter of intelligence. It's a matter of delivery. Because God does not reveal himself to those who know more. He reveals himself to those who are willing to stop, sit at the table, and break bread with him. The question that remains is, how many times has God been walking by your side and you have not recognized it? 10. Everything has changed. After the resurrection, nothing was the same again. And this is not a symbolic phrase. It is a verifiable historical fact. The same men who fled, denied, and hid, within a few weeks were standing before the same authorities who had crucified Jesus, declaring without hesitation that he was alive. They did not change their speech. They did not moderate the message. They did not negotiate with power. They told the truth as it was and accepted the consequences. And the consequences were brutal. Peter, who denied Jesus 3 times, was crucified upside down in Rome. James, John's brother, was beheaded by Herod Agrippa. Andrew was crucified on a cross in the shape of an X. Thomas, who doubted, traveled to India to preach and was killed with spears. Bartholomew was skinned alive. Matthew was murdered in Ethiopia. Each of them had the opportunity to retreat. Each of them could have said, We made it all up. None of them did that, because it was not an invention. They had seen it, they had played, they had eaten with the risen Christ. And no threat from the world was enough to make someone deny what they saw with their own eyes. The resurrection did not only produce courage in the disciples, it produced an entirely new community. In the following days, thousands of people in Jerusalem came to believe. Devout Jews who had kept the Sabbath sacred for centuries began to gather on the first day of the week, Sunday, in memory of the day Jesus was resurrected. This change is extraordinary. You don't alter an age-old tradition without an overwhelming reason. And the reason was only one. Something happened that Sunday that surpassed everything that came before. The book of Acts records that the early Christians sold property, shared everything, cared for one another, faced persecution with joy, and lived in a way that astonished Rome. They were not people seeking power. They were people transformed by an encounter. And this encounter was not with a philosophy. It was with one person. A person who was dead and now lived. This singular fact, the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, is the foundation of everything that was built afterwards. And what does that mean for you, right now, today? It means that the resurrection is not a doctrine to be debated. It is a reality to be faced. If Jesus was resurrected, then everything he said is true. If the tomb is empty, then death is not the end. If he has conquered the grave, then no darkness in your life is definitive. No crisis is final. No diagnosis is an absolute sentence. No defeat is permanent. Because the same power that raised Jesus from that tomb is available to anyone who surrenders to him with sincerity. The resurrection did not stop in the 33rd year. It keeps happening. In every life that is plucked from spiritual death. In every heart that is awakened from the darkness. In every soul they hear the voice of God calling by name, just as Mary heard in that garden. The final question is not whether the resurrection happened. The question is, what are you going to do now that you know it happened?